we're joking maybe 5 years ago living in the manor, and we were like, we're making everybody quit their jobs. Like everybody is like, oh, finally I'm in a place where I feel supported by all these other people and it's not just me against the world. And I'm finally going to, quit my job that I thought I needed to feel safe. And I'm going to do the thing that I've always wanted to do, or I'm going to take a little bit of time off. And people go through these personal transitions in community because they're supported in their whole being. So when it works well, it's an incredibly beautiful thing. And I've personally felt the benefit of that. And that was always our vision from the beginning. If we didn't use these terms publicly because it's a little cheesy, but we're like, we want these to be incubators for personal development. But these are places where you get to grow as a person and you get to become a bigger and more mature version of yourself.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on this episode, I'm joined by Jay Standish, a real estate entrepreneur that co-founded a company called OpenDoor Coliving that focused on creating community housing in urban locations on the West Coast. This episode is not our usual flavor for the show, because for this show, we have guest Jay Standish, who shares his perspective and experience with his company, OpenDoor Coliving, which he recently closed down in 2022. This was after he and his partner, Ben Provan, devoted 9 years of their lives to grow the company, starting with them living in group co-housing in the Bay Area. They went on to expand into new construction, working with developers in Portland and Seattle. And in many ways, they were pioneers to create a whole new category for commercial real estate, when at the time, co-living was quite underground and informal. I appreciate Jay coming on and being so open and vulnerable. As an entrepreneur, I know what it's like to give things your all, only for them to turn out not as you had hoped for. And we're fortunate to have him share his perspective, because so often an entrepreneur's job is to paint optimistic, rosy pictures and to be the consummate salesperson, especially on podcasts. But so often the real nuggets come from when people have had to make hard decisions. Jay is smart and talented and has incredible insights from his time leading OpenDoor that I'm sure you'll appreciate just as much as I did. Jay, I am excited to have you on, because you had reached out and I had known about OpenDoor. And I thought, man, this is really germane to a lot of things that are coming up right now with people really seeking out community. But to get into this conversation, I always like to go back to not just the genesis of your professional life, but really what are those stepping stones from a younger age that got you interested in real estate development, co-housing, co-living, and things like that?
Yeah. Clear for me, when I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, I grew up in a suburban area, but we had woods around us. Our house was kind of in the woods. And so I spent a lot of time playing in the woods and in creeks and in nature. And I remember going to my dad and being like, hey, I want to learn how to make my own cabin. I was always making forts in the woods. I was like, I really want to learn how to make a cabin, and I want to learn how to grow my own food. And my dad was like, I'm not a very outdoorsy person. I don't really know anything about that. But your uncle used to go to this canoe trip camp in Canada called Keewaydin. and you should talk to him, because they would do a lot of fishing and it was out in the wilderness. It was not exactly building houses and farming, but it's that kind of thing. And so I talked to my uncle, ended up going to this camp, maybe starting at 12 years old. And I went 4 summers. And by the end, you're doing a long 40-day canoe trip. And we had all old school wood canvas canoes and these like leather tump lines to carry the canoe on your head. And we'd chop down dead trees and saw them up and chop them up to make firewood every day. And we would cook all of our meals over the fire and fish for extra food. Living in the wilderness for 40 days with 10 or 12 young men and then two staff. And so that was my first experience of community. Isn't quite the right word. I would say it's more like a team, or, you could say a tribe. But there's a strong sense of, we can't get there alone. We're only as fast as the slowest person. And we all need to paddle across the lake, and we all need to do our fair share of cooking and dishes and chopping wood. And, it rains in the summer in northern Canada. We paddled throughout Ontario, Quebec, Labrador, and our final trip was from the border of Saskatchewan and Manitoba up into Nunavut and over to Hudson Bay. It's about, I think, probably about a 700, 800 kilometer trip. And so that was my experience of having like a dedicated group of people that were doing something together, doing something ambitious together. And, the trials and tribulations of being in the wilderness for that long and having it rain on you, and mosquitoes and black flies and long days of paddling and doing portages where you're carrying canoes over around rapids and between lakes. And it's pretty difficult way of traveling. And I remember being in college and sort of missing that and being like, I don't feel like I'm part of a group. I'm just sort of one person that's floating in and out. I have friends and stuff, but I missed that sense of being really dialed in with a group of people and being a real team on something. And also just the lifestyle of, coming back to civilization, you're like, why do we have all this stuff? Like, life can be so rich when it's simple. You don't have dishwashers and cars and computers and all this stuff that makes life complicated. Getting back to simplicity and choosing to have a life that's really just about people and living together. So that definitely informed my inspiration around community living. And I was living in Seattle and started business school on Bainbridge Island, and had been involved in helping to create a co-working space called Impact Hub in Seattle for social entrepreneurs and people doing kind of good work in the world to work together. So it was, had this angle of physical spaces with, community and groups of people, but also sort of a business model around it. And ended up meeting my business partner in the sustainable business program called BGI at the time, Bainbridge Graduate Institute. And his name's Ben Provan, my co-founder. So maybe I'll pause there because I've given maybe the origin of why I care about community.
Oh, that's amazing. I grew up going to canoe camp as well, but we didn't do anything like a 40-day trek. I think the longest that we did was 7 days. And it really brings back memories. And it's funny just to highlight this for everybody, but the common thread that's woven throughout all these interviews on this podcast is some deeper connection to nature as a child. So for all the parents out there, this is a PSA of like, these are the memories that get embedded as seeds, and it matters of where we end up taking our lives. But I'm curious, Jay, because the BGI, I know a couple of real estate folks that have come out of there. When did you really start to think, okay, creating the space for people is going to be the entry point for me? Because I would imagine this is the same time if you're doing co-working, like the around the same time WeWork might have been getting up and going and gaining some steam. Like, what was that for you?
Yeah, WeWork was around in New York. I remember touring one of their first properties around that time. This would have been 2010, 2011. And actually, before I started at BGI, I was brainstorming about a physical space for social entrepreneurs, and put together like a concept paper and was like floating it around to different people in Seattle, and eventually met a guy named Brian Howe and found out about the Impact, was now called Impact Hub, which used to be just be called the Hub, which was or it still is a network of co-working spaces for social entrepreneurs. It started in Europe. And I went to Europe and visited a number of those hubs one summer and got inspired about it. And Brian and I decided to create a hub in Seattle. And Brian ended up running with it. We actually went out to BGI to visit them to think about being partners with BGI in some way or another. And I kind of fell in love with the college. And also, I think I remember feeling stuck with the entrepreneurial catch 22 of sort of needing resources to be able to do the planning and the research and the design to figure things out, but then not having those resources to then do the work to secure the resources, and a lot of just different things that sort of needed to happen all at once. And so I sort of felt like I wanted more training. And I think in hindsight, an entrepreneurial mindset is sort of a thing that maybe people either have or don't have. And I ended up kind of figuring it out. But Brian ended up running with starting the hub. And so that's kind of how the space thing got started. I was living in a intentional community in undergrad. So that kind of got me interested in community living, and had always lived with roommates, in, even if it was 3 or 4 roommates, in sort of more thoughtful and deliberate and intentional ways, like little mini co-living houses. So I sort of had always been doing co-living in some form or another during my young adulthood. And so when Ben Provan, my business partner, and I met at BGI, he had been working on a grass-fed cattle ranch and was feeling lonely up in Mendocino County and trying to build community around the ranch, and it didn't really happen. And we met a group called the Embassy in San Francisco that was starting what they were calling a co-living house, which really wasn't a term that we'd ever heard before. And they were modeling that term after co-working. And we thought what they were doing is really interesting, partially because it was cast to a broader audience of people. It didn't feel too granola or too sort of Berkeley commune culture. It felt like, there's scientists there and people doing policy stuff and entrepreneurs, and it felt like a broader group of people that it could be accessible to. And we just liked that sort of fresh pair of eyes. And it was also an urban project in San Francisco, and it wasn't sort of trying to be off the land or off the grid. It was sort of like, let's be involved in cities and be involved in society and sort of try to change things from the inside. And so we kind of shadowed and were friends with the Embassy folks as they were starting that house. And we ended up starting our own house in Berkeley, essentially as our capstone project for our MBA program, which is a house called a Sandbox House that doesn't exist anymore. And physically exists, but doesn't exist as a community house anymore. It was kind of our prototype in Berkeley.
And what was the thinking at the time? Was it we're going to develop these spaces or from ground up with co-living houses, or were you thinking more let's go find an existing structure because probably the financing would be easier that way? But yeah, I'm not sure.
It's a great question. We were definitely asking that question, and we partnered with an architect in the early days who was excited by the idea of designing and building new construction co-living or co-housing projects. And
who was that?
It was a guy named Todd Jersey. He's an architect in Berkeley. And we ended up kind of going in the early stages, we went the route of using existing houses and taking a little bit more of a lean approach, because it just takes so long to build something from scratch. And it was a new concept, and getting equity investment for a new housing type that's relatively unproven and uncommon, it's like sort of a difficult thing to make happen, which I'll get to later in the conversation. But so we started out basically finding old mansions around the Bay Area. And the first house we just leased personally. The second house, called the farmhouse, we master leased. As the owner was finishing renovations, they wanted a team that could kind of steward it over the long term. She'd had like a couple groups fall apart or fall out, and we had sort of started this house and we were starting a business around it, and so she was essentially our first customer, and all the residents there we were customers too. And sort of our business model was always in between the owners and the residents. Really had two types of customers, and so we grew over time to do new construction ourselves, as well as partnering with developers who are doing new construction. They call it build to suit co-living, that it's specifically designed and built for a co-living use. And eventually sort of blurring the lines between co-living and micro apartments. So our entire Seattle portfolio was all micro apartments with common space on each floor. So it was micro apartment co-living. It truly was a hybrid. So we did eventually get into new construction, and there's some other players who definitely did new construction co-living in the U.S. as well as in Europe. But I'll get to that maybe in a later phase of it. I think in the early phase, it was all about learning what community living was and what the resident experience was. And so Ben and I lived first for a year and a half in this prototype house called the Sandbox House. And then we ended up being property managers for a house called Euclid Manor, which was or still is a Victorian 13-bedroom house in Oakland. And we started that house with 3 other friends as sort of founding members, and I lived there for about 5 years, or 5.5 years maybe. And so we lived and breathed and slept and ate community for many years. And through doing it ourselves, learned, how to run a house meeting, how to create a food program, how to create shared agreements, what the pet policy was and the guest policy and the shoes off or shoes on policy, and how to do shared finances for food and toilet paper and cleaning and stuff like that. And so we ended up, evolving that over time into sort of having a community program on top of being a property manager who collects rents and signs leases and manages repairs and does the accounting and has insurance and runs sort of the operation. We were also a community manager who helped to find initial founding residents and get behind them in creating a vision and a sort of an ethos and a culture for the house. And then we would deliver a series of workshops on house meetings and food systems and shared agreements and conflict resolution, and all the different factors of the sort of social experience of living in community.
I've got so many questions. I got to figure out what the best entry point is here. But you've got this dual market, right? You've got to go find the properties, and then you got to tell them, look, we want to master lease this, and then we're going to rent out the bedrooms. Was there a lot of objections to that, or was there a size of property that you found, we're going to target this, but we still have to get over working with the owner? What was that like?
Yeah, it was a lot of work. Yeah, I mean, a huge amount of our work was in, business development and real estate acquisitions, or just finding properties to lease or manage. And usually the way it worked was finding an investor or an owner who wants to either invest in a deal that we put together or will just buy a property on our behalf. So we ended up meeting a Japanese family office that we did 4 small houses with that were like mansions, single family homes. And so they went and bought the properties and then we managed them for them. So we had a little portfolio with them. And then, we had a developer in Portland who is a general contractor and developer who we did a couple projects with where they bought and renovated and then built new construction on 2 different sites. Had sort of an existing building, and then they built new buildings as well for co-living, and then we managed those for them. Another developer in Portland who had done one co-housing project and built a co-living project for us to manage. And then in those projects, we were very involved in the design and sort of consulted with the developers from concept through, much more specific designs and permitting. And then eventually, we would buy the furnishings and do little details like that directly. So, it was in the early days, people were like, what's co-living? And then eventually there were other companies doing co-living. And so there were enough people in the real estate market who knew what co-living was. And then we started getting this question, like, how are you different? We're like, okay, well, we started off as like essentially the only people doing this. And now we're being asked to like defend why we're different. And so our focus is more on deep community. And also we're like, hey, we have more hands-on experience with this. These other groups have never lived in community themselves, or have raised venture money, are trying to grow really fast, and they don't get community as well as we do. So that was kind of our differentiator. But as we got to a bigger scale, we were trying to raise private equity funds to do institutional scale buildings, meaning like 150 plus units. And that's where we saw the most headwinds, especially because we were trying to raise capital during COVID for a concept that maybe was the optics didn't quite look right during a pandemic to sort of be building new construction in primary cities, like large cities where people were actually leaving large cities during the pandemic and saying, hey, let's put like 10, 20 people into a community house together during, shelter in place. It was kind of a headwind in terms of investors thinking that was where the market wanted to be. And we were able to lease the properties, but it was hard during the pandemic. We had a lot more turnover. I mean, for the first 3 or 4 years of the business, we had 100% occupancy all the time. And
Wow,
only really until
incredible.
the pandemic did we start having occupancy challenges, and really had to build a much more professional marketing and sales funnel to actually fill the rooms. For the first few years, the rooms kind of filled themselves.
What is the ideal size of community? Like if you're developing 160 room co-living space, is that just too much? Or did you ever find that sweet spot of this is the number that we really like?
What you do is you break it up into what we call them pods, but the number is around 10 to 15 residents per pod. And so our ideal design is it's essentially a 10 to 15 bedroom co-living apartment that's its own self-contained home that has a big shared kitchen, living room, den, common spaces for those 10 or 12 people to live as a community together and have a meal program together, have house meetings together. So we were sort of taking what we had done in mansions that were 10, 12, 15 bedrooms, and then just flattening that out into an apartment in a building. And depending on the shape of the building, you might have 1 per floor, you might have 2, 3 per floor. And then those stack on top of each other and become, 100 plus unit co-living apartment building that has these individual communities within them. But there was a lot of push and pull around design, both because of permitting headwinds that, in some cities you could have a maximum bedroom count of 4 bedrooms for a home or for a unit. So you can't create an 8-bedroom unit by right. And then also from an investment perspective, the amount of common space that was required, it was just a risk. They didn't see it as a normal apartment building. What happens if the co-living thing doesn't work out? What happens if people start, arguing and tearing each other's hair out, and you need to revert back to something with less social risk? We would have to sort of think through, we call it, backwards compatibility, where you could convert it back into, 2, 3, 4 bedroom apartments that could be leased out relatively normally. And so, micro units started to becoming palatable. It was like, okay, these are studio apartments essentially. Like, people need studio apartments. That makes sense. And there was less social risk, but there was also less social reward, in that there were sort of independent apartments, and the common space felt more like a public apartment amenity space than it did feel like your own home that was internal to a shared space with a group of people that you knew really well. So yeah, I mean, I could probably give a PhD dissertation on the floor plan design and the interplay between the physical space and the community program, and what works and what doesn't work, because we got pretty deep into that. We had 19 properties and 400 units when we at our height and when we closed, and we were very picky about the deals that we did. We passed on lots of properties and saw other co-living companies take them on and then eventually go out of business before we did. And so we were just really careful about the kind of projects that we did, because we wanted to do things that we knew would build community in a way that works, and also pricing that was connected to reality and that was actually market for what people were willing to pay.
Let me see if I can understand the business model a little bit more. Like, were you just that essentially an expanded but niche property management firm where you didn't actually own the buildings or the assets? Or was that the direction that you're going in, was ownership?
Yeah, at the core, we on all of our properties, we were the property manager. And then we had different deal structures with different projects, and it evolved over time. I mean, the first few years, I didn't have a real estate background. We didn't do this to create a real estate company. We did it to build community. And then we figured out that we were a real estate company, and learned real estate, learned development, learned investment, learned property management, all of that. And so the direction we were going in, and sort of the final trimester of the company, if you will, we were going toward vertical integration, meaning we were going to be the property manager, we were going to be the investor, and we were going to be a co-developer. We wanted to partner with developers and essentially raise all the capital for them and have a good amount of input on design and floor plan and sort of product, so to speak, and then be the long-term operator. And what we found is, property management is a very low margin business. And so it was sort of a means to an end to get to the point where we could raise capital and be a capital allocator, an investor, and share in the development returns that the developer earns by doing a good project. Because we learned a ton about how to design and build a good co-living project by doing it ourselves. And so that was the headwind that we got to during COVID. It was just really difficult to raise capital at an institutional scale. Like, we had done plenty of smaller projects with the investors would be, what people call doctors and lawyers, local developers raising capital from their personal networks of, relatively high net worth individuals, but nothing crazy. People are investing 100, maybe 200K at a time. And we just needed to graduate to sort of the next phase of investment, which is working with more like family offices and boutique private equity groups. And so we gave it, not only college try, probably the graduate school try for a number of years, and brought on a team of 3 more senior business development folks, with like Harvard Business School backgrounds and, billions of real estate development experience under their belts, who are, a decade or so older than my business partner, myself, and talked to a ton of investors and it just wasn't happening. And a lot of other co-living companies had either gone out of business or were in the process of going out of the business as we were trying to raise, more professional capital. And then eventually the interest rates went up and like all development sort of ceased. Like people weren't writing checks to build new projects in US cities for a number of months at the end of last year. So that was kind of the final nail on the coffin, that like all development capital was just seizing up.
Before we get back into this episode, I want to share an exciting announcement about a very special opportunity to gather with some of the country's most innovative and pioneering professionals that are helping to grow the field of regenerative real estate. At the end of this summer, we are hosting the second annual Regenerative Real Estate Gathering that will be held outside of Portland, Maine at the Riverbend Farm. This year, our theme is from ownership to stewardship. And not only will attendees get a chance to hear from incredible speakers and organizations doing work around ecological resilience, inclusive real estate development, regenerative design, and advanced sustainable practices, but it is also an opportunity to connect, unwind, and play. This is an opportunity to nurture your spirit, to get inspired, and to connect with incredible people in a unique place that comes with certified living buildings, delicious organic feasts from the farm on site, swims in the rejuvenating Saco River, and activities like yoga and dance. Last year, we were blown away by the wide array of people from developers, architects, investors, planners, realtors, and earth stewards. To find out more about this special gathering, you can find the link in our show notes or go to our website at chooselatitude.com/gathering. I hope to see you there. What a wild ride, because it sounds like you had a lot of education to do at the very beginning of this is why it's a good idea. It really seemed, especially being in Portland in that like 2014, 15, 16 period, that developers in the commercial real estate industry got really excited about, oh, we don't have to put in extra kitchens and all that. Like we can actually have a more efficient floor plan.
Yeah.
To then like, oh, now we have this pandemic where a lot of caution gets thrown to the wind. But just coming from that commercial real estate development perspective of, you see why these developers, they love to create boxes that then somebody else has to manage, or, it's almost as like the industry wants to be as hands-off as possible. And they just make money because of the flow, the velocity of money that supports it.
Yeah. I mean, and that was a lot of the push and pull with both investors and developers on the floor plan in terms of what we were going to build. It always looks better on paper to put smaller bedrooms in and have a larger number of bedrooms sharing, less common space. But the reality is that the projects that we had that performed the best, that had the least vacancy and the best total overall rents, had generous amounts of common space and big enough rooms for someone who would want to live there for 3 years. If you live in a 100 square foot bedroom, yeah, you might be able to pull off living there for 3-6 months. And then you're like, I'm going to find a longer term place for me where I can have a desk in my room. Especially if you're living in community, your bedroom is not just the place you sleep. That might be where you work during the day. And you at least be able to like hang out with 1 or 2 friends in your room. And ideally, you have a couch in there and a desk. So it does kind of need to be closer to a studio apartment for it to be a long-term housing product for someone. And that's eventually where we arrived. I mean, early days, we were even doing sort of like short-term rental, Airbnb kind of stuff in a couple of the bedrooms in the house. So like when we were master leasing, there was no real margin for us to make as a company. And so we were trying to earn extra revenue through doing short-term rentals. And we ended up paying most of that money to the residents to manage the guest program. So we didn't end up actually making much money off of it. And it became sort of a social drag on the community. So we locked in on long-term housing, year-long leases relatively early on, where like still to this day, there's co-living people doing projects where they're short and medium term stays are a big part of their model for like remote workers. If you have like a co-living place in Bali for remote workers, they're going to sign like leases for a month or 2 months or maybe even a couple weeks. But that was never our model. We were always long-term housing. So
this is just an assumption, but like, is it heavy towards a younger demographic or like the younger side of the millennials?
Yeah, it was definitely in the first half of our journey. We sort of thought of it as like 25 to 35. We were very much in that demographic during that time and tended to attract folks that kind of looked like us. And that evolved over time. After the first 2 or 3 years, we were also growing and had more spaces to fill and got really focused on diversity of all sorts, including age, but also sort of like educational background, socioeconomic background, race, sexual orientation. All of those things are very important for building community. And frankly, being relevant to as broad of a group of people as you can be. You don't want people to self-select out because they're like, this is nice, but like no one here looks like me, and this doesn't feel like I would fit in here. And so, probably the last thing to go was age, where that was a hard one, where it would sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, where you see in the age range, someone who's like 65 shows up, they're like, wow, this is just a bunch of 20 and 30 somethings. Like, I don't know. But in Seattle, where we had micro apartments, that was less important. And from the beginning, we were like, you know what? We're not going to try to curate this group based on anything other than their desire to live in community. And frankly, as we got bigger and more mature and more professional, like you understand the housing laws and discrimination laws, and like strangely, we were, if anything, discriminating for diversity. So we found ourselves in a tricky position every once in a while where we're like, we can't run afoul of discrimination here in the process of trying to create a diverse community. It's like we're following the intent of the law, but not the letter of the law, maybe. And we never crossed that line, but we were always very aware of it. And, the residents were also very involved in curating the community. And so, one of the lessons learned is for co-living, and by that I mean really rental housing in a community context and in an urban context. For co-living to work at scale, there need to be some policy changes that would enable some of the big problems to be averted. And one of those is there just has to be some way for a community to vote out a member based on things not working out socially. Because someone can be like really challenging from a personality perspective and make other people even feel unsafe and just like sours the tone massively in the community. But technically, they didn't break any clause in the lease or any evictable offense, which is like, for good reason. It's, you don't want landlords like finding sneaky ways to kick people out. But if the community votes that this person is not a fit, we had no way of enforcing that. We even had that happen a few times and the person didn't agree to go. And we're like, the community was mad at us because they're like, we thought we could just vote people out. And we're like, well, unfortunately, this person kind of maybe got a lawyer or something and knows that they can't be kicked out just because they're being asked to leave by the community. And we had to, we couldn't wrongfully evict someone. We'd have to go to them and be like, we're just kind of asking nicely at this point. It would take a ton of time and energy from our team. And it was like deep emotional labor to, try to unpack these things. And it would take, easily an entire week of one full-time person's time to extricate a tricky resident. when the community was basically imploding around that person, and we were at risk of like losing everyone, which happened a few times, and we had to reboot the community and start it over from scratch. So that's the kind of challenge that co-living faces operationally. And so, I really believe in it from a community perspective, and I don't know whether there's a viable path toward being an operator managing truly shared living spaces. I think micro apartments, yes. But I wonder if there's a different way of approaching it where potentially even enabling community ownership financially of the property, and that sort of shifts the relationship where now they're sort of stewarding their own property. Something like that could make sense to me, where maybe the developer builds a project to be sold to community owners. I'd love to see something like that happen. And we never were able to do that, but I'm actually consulting with some folks that are trying to do stuff like that, because I think it just feels like the fulfillment of a vision that a lot of people have. A lot of our residents have always been curious about, how they can own the property. And it's a non-trivial question from a financial underwriting perspective.
Yeah, this story is recounting maybe even a little bit of PTSD of our property management ownership days of, you've got 4 roommates and one of them beat up the other roommate's boyfriend and is like locked himself in his bedroom, and, just like A to Z, having to work interpersonally around some of these issues as a landlord. And I want to just underscore for the listeners that you're working in Washington State, Oregon, and California, like really favoring tenant rights over some states. Like I would imagine Texas probably has no tenant protections. That's a
Right.
complete guess for all the Texans that are listening.
I think that's roughly true statewide in Texas, but yeah. Yes, that is a major. We were working in some of the most highly regulated housing markets in the country, and some of the most expensive housing markets in the country. And there's no malintent on we weren't trying to kick out existing residents so that we could renovate the property and massively raise rents. We're just trying to keep the social order in place. And we've definitely had some residents who lived there for a long time, but we never really got to the point where we have a bunch of rent levels that are at 10 years ago pricing. We weren't trying to kick people out to raise the rent. We're just trying to make sure that someone who really wasn't working for the community wasn't going to take the whole thing down with them and cause an extraordinary amount of emotional pain in the process. And like you said, I don't want to get too much into specific scenarios, but in the early days we had basically no problems, and we never had to ask someone to leave or even have that conversation. But as we got bigger, just maybe partially a numbers thing, and some of the projects that we did were maybe not perfect from a common space perspective, and the pricing needed to be pushed because the developers, spent a lot on the construction and needed to get the rents to a level that probably was a little bit pushing it from a market perspective. And so, yeah, it's pretty heavy work at a certain level. We had to really make sure our team was doing okay. Sometimes residents would come after us or say really unkind things to our staff members and be really rude or be really difficult. Um, you know, humans are a little challenging sometimes, and you're very much on the front lines of the human experience when you're working in property management, and particularly in community.
Oh, totally. Jay, let me ask you, it seems like, and maybe this is a post-COVID perspective and really listening to what people are interested in, but I've been hearing more and more that people are wanting to live in community. Maybe it's just we're self-selective in the folks that are coming to us because they want to build from scratch a new community. And then the really ambitious ones want to do it off grid and challenging locations. But it also seems like, on the other hand, that there might be that sentiment that people want to live more in community, but we have no basis and no memory of how to actually do that.
Right.
Like we've been living in this like single use zone existence for so long, the rugged individualist,
Right.
the white picket fence. Did you find those challenges as well, or would
Definitely.
people
Yeah.
kind of integrate in pretty well?
That's a really great question. I do think community is a skill that's learned, and there are many subcultures within American society, but generally and on average, we are a more individualistic society and have lost some of those. We call them citizenship muscles, but the skills of existing in community, and that people aren't used to optimizing for other people's needs. They're just sort of negotiating for their own needs. And a lot of the conflict that comes up is like, ideally, someone grows through the process of a conflict or a challenge happening, and they actually start caring about the other people that they live with, and they bond with them. They actually become close with them, and they will optimize for the other person's need because they care about them. And they're like, I actually legitimately want everybody to win here. And I don't need to view this as like a me versus you dynamic. And so that was what it was really beautiful when that happens. And a number of our communities matured in that way and were able to be very, very healthy and continue on to this day. I mean, all of our properties continue on under new property managers, and no one got kicked out or left or lost their housing when OpenDoor shut down. So all of our properties still exist as communities. They're just under different management now. And so a number of those communities are really strong and have been for years. And it's really cool to see when a culture is healthy and strong and mature, that like the individuals that come in kind of level up to the social dynamics that are in place, that work and that cause the community to be an exciting place that people want to come visit and want to live there. And it empowers people to be their best self and to take risks. I mean, we're joking maybe 5 years ago living in the manor, and like we were like, we're making everybody quit their jobs. Like everybody's like, oh, finally I'm in a place where I feel supported by all these other people, and it's not just me against the world. And I'm finally gonna quit my job that I thought I needed to feel safe, and I'm gonna do the thing that I've always wanted to do, or I'm gonna take a little bit of time off. And people go through these personal transitions in community because they're supported in their whole being. So when it works well, it's an incredibly beautiful thing. And I've personally felt the benefit of that. And that was always our vision from the beginning. Is we didn't use these terms publicly because it's a little cheesy, but we're like, we want these to be incubators for personal development. That these are places where you get to grow as a person, and you get to become a bigger and more mature version of yourself through honestly, through sometimes difficult moments with other people. And that you become a polished stone when you rub up against other stones. So I will say, yeah, there's a lot of desire to the community, but it is a real skill. And there's barriers. Both the real estate is a massive barrier, just financing it, but also it's a funky property type that doesn't really exist. And so getting it permitted can be challenging. But you're getting married with like 10, 20 people if you're buying the property. So it is a real skill, and there's communities that have gone really well and communities that haven't. And one thing that we definitely learned through doing this is that essentially being able to the hiring or recruitment of people who have that je ne sais quoi of like community facilitation skill, we got pretty good at identifying that in other people. And I remember hiring someone. We didn't have a role available, and we didn't have tons of capital, but like we were like, we kind of have to hire this person because like they're like MIT level social emotional intelligence, like they're like world class community person, and we just need them on our team, and we'll figure it out. And it was true. Like we became an absolutely indispensable member of our team. So Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things evolve over the next, decades, and what Gen Z's version of community living is. I think people kind of give us a little bit of trouble, like, oh, come on, you think you like invented something new? This has like been done a million times, and like, why do you have to use a new word, and blah blah blah. And partially it's for investors and stuff like that, but each generation kind of reinvents it and makes it their own. So it will be very interesting to see what Gen Z does with community living.
You bring up a good point, because what I don't think that people see a lot of is that if you're just going to pass around a meme of like, I just want to live in community with a bunch of my friends, and if you come at it from a real estate perspective, you're providing the space that should transcend the first generation into the second generation and really ad infinitum, right? Like, people don't think about that longevity of how do you maintain space and community whenever people are entering and exiting at different points of the year, and just the complexity that
Mm-hmm.
that comes with that, and um, really this cultural turning moment. It makes me think of, we had Katie McCammett on here, who, for those of you that don't know, Katie and her then husband Chuck really created the term co-housing, and she was saying, Jay, that the thing that she gets a lot is that people are like, oh, I don't want to do co-living, I don't want to live with folks that intimately. And she's like, no, we're doing co-housing, not co-living. um, but it is interesting that you have these kind of parallel, intertwined but separate community based lifestyles
Mm-hmm.
that are coming up at a really interesting point in time.
Yeah, and I think I'm a millennial. I'm 38 at this point in 2023, and I know a lot of my friends are leaning toward the co-housing idea more, and a lot more folks are like, I love my own apartment, I love my own unit, but I want to be around my friends and their spaces. And I live in an apartment building here in Oakland that happens to have a lot of like artists and designers and interesting people, and there's no real common space. There's actually a sweet little alley garden outdoor space, but we have a Slack group, and like there's a little bit of events happening and stuff like that. So I think that there's actually a lot of community that can be built in traditional apartment buildings, just by sort of getting folks together and hanging out. It's great to have the common space and the common rooms, but it's not entirely necessary. I mean, I know folks in San Francisco who have a project where they're just trying to like encourage people to rent and buy homes all in the same neighborhood, so they can be near each other and it's easier to hang out. So there's a lot of flavors that community building can take that interface with housing, but there's also third spaces, co-working spaces. There's a startup called Ground Floor that's basically making like a kind of really accessible like member club idea, where it's not quite a cafe or a restaurant or a co-working space. It's sort of a weird mix of all of those things, but you see a lot of the same people there, and your people are members there. And so I think there's a lot of different interesting ways to build community, and to figure out. I think the challenge is figuring out how a business model fits onto that, because it can be awkward. It's closer to family than it is to a commercial transaction. And so finding ways to make these things happen and have them be viable, and maybe they don't necessarily have to be profitable, but you still need some sort of operating model and business model to be able to get these kinds of projects done. And sometimes that can be challenging to do at a small scale, because you need a support team, or you need a third party of some sort. And that's what we were for 10 years. We were that third party that could come in if there was a conflict and facilitate a transitional plan.
What happens whenever you get to a point where you've invested so much time and energy, and you've ignited this flame for a movement, but how do you make the decision to say, we're going to do something different, or we need to go separate ways? What did that look like?
Like to shut down the company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, it was a decision over almost a year. I'd say the main one, we weren't able to raise this real estate fund that we could have kept going deal by deal, but we were 10 years into it, and to entrepreneur something for 10 years, take a pretty significant personal financial um, risk on that and not have it pan out. It's sort of the moment where you go, cool. I think 10 years of rolling the rock up the hill is a full effort. And getting to 19 properties and 400 units across 3 states, we're like, we did the thing. We didn't just have 2-3 houses. We really got this thing to a certain scale. It's not like a massive scale, but like it's enough where we had a dozen team members, and it was a lot of work. And so just at a personal level, it just wasn't worth additional entrepreneurial risk, and it was going to be another 10 years to be like, okay, now we're going to have to go property by property, raising money $100,000 at a time to buy properties and build a portfolio that in 10 years as entrepreneurs we will be able to like pay ourselves what we could probably go out and get a job for now. And so that's sort of the short answer. But the combination of the operations being really staff intensive and never being profitable just from a property management perspective, we were burning cash, not crazy amounts, but it wasn't a profitable operation. And then not being able to raise capital and just knowing that there was major headwinds. It wasn't just like a brief. COVID was not helpful, but it wasn't just that. It was really more that all these other co-living companies had gone out of business, and it was just a bad sentiment in the market around co-living and from an investment perspective. So we had a very graceful wind down. We had many months of planning whether to make the decision or not, giving our staff a couple months heads up that we were going to be winding down, and giving all of our owners a couple months to transition to new managers. And then we serviced sort of even after we closed, there were a couple months there where we were doing accounting and we were, handing off utility accounts still, and sort of serviced, multi-month handoff to make sure, these 19 different properties were in as good standing as we could leave them. And part of that is just kind of trying to doing the right thing. Once you're like surrender the fact that you're not going to get anything personally financially from this, and you surrender the fact that like the company needs to shut down and this it's not going to go on anymore, you just kind of want to make sure that everybody involved has a good taste in their mouth, or at least not a bad taste. And so it just became actually kind of a beautiful process of closure, making sure that residents were in a good place and owners are in a good place, and new managers, had the tools and information they needed. So, yeah, I mean, it was a lot to hold responsibility wise, and just it's a complex operation. And so, it was a relief at some level to let go of the company and not have that responsibility on your shoulders anymore. So yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring what's next, and have had a little bit of time to sort of do some consulting part time, but also just have some breathing room and recuperate a little bit from the journey.
Well, what an incredible experience. I know it's a really tongue in cheek quote that you're either earning or learning, but I mean, there's not too many other people that gets a front row seat into here's how we're at the forefront of a shift in how we organize around space and bring community together. You've raised private equity and investment funds and worked on the design side and on the property management side. Like that's a lot. That's a wath of experience. Where do you take that? I mean, what, maybe you don't know consciously, but like, will it be within the same bringing community together theme, or maybe you want to exit real estate and all this entirely?
Yeah, I'm not 100% clear at this moment. I am still interested in community, and I am still interested in real estate. And partially, like you said, learning so much over 10 years, I kind of want to be helpful to other people. I kind of want to put it to use and be supportive to other community projects or other real estate projects or companies that are trying to do similar things, and be like, hey, like, you should make use of my 10 years of learning and like help you avoid some pitfalls that might be easily avoidable if you have someone with some hands-on experience to be able to guide you a little bit. So I've already been doing some of that from a consulting angle, and I'm sort of curious about what other people are doing right now, and what sort of interesting ideas folks are trying to make happen. So yeah, I'm definitely looking at stuff in sort of the real estate innovation world, talking to people doing property technology stuff. I'm very interested in community ownership and different ownership models for folks who don't traditionally have access to capital to be able to start earning equity in real estate. And so, yeah, ownership model and financial model innovation in real estate is very interesting to me. So, yeah, those are the sort of the current threads.
What about Ben? Do you know what's he on to?
Yeah, Ben and I are still really close. We actually talk every morning at 9 a.m. and check in. We're essentially still like business partners, but the business is no longer there. We're just sort of career support partners, along with another friend of ours. And he's also pretty open-ended in terms of what he's looking for. And he has an engineering background as well. So he's also sort of looking at like climate tech companies that maybe have an engineering component, but need someone with like real hands-on business experience and operating experience, and thinking about like, how to bring products to market and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think he's a little bit more interested in using his engineering skills again, but in sort of a business capacity. And I think I'm a little bit more interested in still being involved in like community and real estate stuff than Ben, but I also think that he's pretty open-minded. So.
And what's the likelihood of you two ever owning a property management company again?
Owning a property management company? Probably zero. I mean, maybe, like if I would say like, if I ever did something very squarely in the space again, it would start from an investment perspective. It would be like, cool, there's clearly not even like, oh, we have an idea. It's like the investor who wants to back it is like a co-founder of a fund. I would do something from that angle and not be as operationally involved personally, and also like maybe outsource some of the operations to other companies. But yeah, I mean, we're really close, Ben and I, and we work well together and know each other really well. We've lived together for multiple years, started this company together, and that's part of why we continue to be like, accountability buddies with one another, because you don't just throw away a relationship. And we've been through a lot together. I mean, we've gone through lots of different, difficult moments in the business, and always come through it together. And, part of that is like, the ability to work through things in a relationship is part of what makes community possible. And so just even in our one-on-one relationship, we're practicing the art of community and human interaction, and, what creates a viable culture of how people get along at the core of like just the two of us. So.
Oh, well, that's beautiful. Jay, because you've got a lot of skills, and I know a lot of people are out there looking, maybe it's how do you raise private investment, or how do you do community design? Where can people learn more about what you're doing right now, or get a hold of you?
Sure. Pretty easy to find. My website is jstandish.com. So JAY standish.com. That's probably the best way to learn more about me and what I'm up to and what I've done in the past. My resume is on there. You can contact me through that website, but I'm also on, LinkedIn and Instagram and stuff like that. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
We'll be sure to link that in the show notes. Jay, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on and really giving us an intimate look at what it's like to swing for the fences too, and to try something new, because I think that's really courageous, and to share that experience and put it out there is truly a gift.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And you had really good questions, so I appreciate our conversation, and thanks for diving in with me.
If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows? Maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.